As you all know, this is the initial reception of our Pass the Torch Artist Talk series here at the WaterFire Art Center. My name is Beth Butterworth. I work on the development team here at WaterFire. As a printmaker and an artist, I'm very, very excited about this evening's talk, as well as all our future Pass the Torch programming, which we will be presenting over the next couple of months. So I'm hoping to see all of these faces at each one. So I want to thank my colleagues, Nicole Neely, Laura Duclos, and Dan Trottier, who have been my partners in developing this millennial-focused project where we connect emerging artists and younger audiences with established networks Rhode Island artists and institutions. The series of artist talks showcase the work of 2 Rhode Island artists whose works share commonality in theme and/or medium. The Pass the Torch series is an outgrowth of a digital project that we did, we created a website that aggregated all of the amazing video artist profiles created by Richard Goulis for the Networks Rhode Island initiative, which was originally a project undertaken by Dr. Chazen with Bert Kranka at AS220. These short films, originally broadcast on Rhode Island PBS, have proven to be of great value to educators, students, artists, and art enthusiasts like yourselves, and can be accessed here online at networksri.org. So we always felt that the next logical step was to screen these videos and invite the Networks Rhode Island artists into the WaterFire Art Center for programming such as this. This exhibition series lends itself to our Millennial Engagement Project, which we are calling the New Flame Campaign. So, future artists in the series include Pionamel Peck, a young photographer and former WaterFire intern whose fashion photography can be found in Vogue. Mary Beth Meehan, whose most recent project was featured on the front page of the Sunday New York Times just a few days ago, and she is here in the audience tonight. And then another artist that we're excited to work with is Jordan Seabury. He is a painter, a RISD graduate, and a grassroots organizer. So in order to stay on top of what we're doing here and what artists are coming in, I encourage all of you to sign up. We have a sign-up sheet back there. Em, will you raise your hand? That's Em, our wonderful intern. She has the sign-up sheet right there. So please give us your email so that we can tell you what's happening. So we have a bunch of other arts programming happening here. So this year we're excited to host the first Motion State Dance Festival. That will be in March. The RISD Grad Show in May, and the 7th Annual Fringe PVD Festival in July. Once again, make sure you sign up so that you can hear about all this programming, and of course the 2020 WaterFire season. So join me in thanking Dr. Joseph Chazen, who created the Networks Rhode Island film series, which features the work of over 200 Rhode Island artists, and who has helped guide us as we develop this Pass the Torch program. Nicole, Dan, Laura, and I want to thank the entire WaterFire team for supporting us with this exciting new millennial initiative. And at that, we are very lucky to have amazing moderators guide us through these artist journeys, starting tonight with Dr. Tripp Evans, Professor of History of Art at Wheaton College, winner of the 2010 National Award for Arts Writing, and former board director for the Providence Athenaeum. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Evans.
Thank you, Bess, and Nicole, and everyone who has helped put this together, and for Dr. Chazen for being the inspiration for this series in terms of bringing these artists together. I am really excited tonight to talk with Andrew and Julia and moderate a conversation with you all about the kind of connections between this work. Andrew's work is familiar to many of you all here. I'm going to give sort of brief introductions to both the artists and a very quick introduction to the film you all will be about to see, and then we'll go into the conversation. Andrew holds a BFA from Boston University and his MFA from Yale. He's taught printmaking at the Rhode Island School of Design since 1991, including one of his students, Julia. So we'll talk about that connection tonight. And Andrew's rightfully known for his extraordinary engraving. both for the kind of sheer beauty of the craftsmanship, kind of mind-blowing execution that you're going to get a little taste of in this film, but also for his thoughtfulness, the way in which he connects his work to our world in a very contemporary sense, while also very much connecting himself and us to artistic forebears from the 17th century right up through Claire Leighton and others, in a really kind of extraordinary way of kind of family connections of printmaking. And Andrew's former student, Julia Samuels, received her MFA in printmaking at RISD in 2015. I think those of you who knew Andrew's work and may not have been as familiar with Julia's work coming in, certainly not surprised to think about this connection between the two of them. Obviously their work is quite different in some ways, but certainly the quality of the work that you see in this room and the real sort of mesmerizing sense of scene play that you see in these works, I think has a real kinship to Andrew's work. Julia, not long after finishing her MFA program, was Overpass the year following or sort of simultaneous with?
I started to work on it almost immediately after.
So what a great model to our artists up and coming, that while Julia was finishing her MFA program, she founded Overpass Projects. And that's, we see a portfolio of works from Overpass Projects in Pawtucket. Here, it's an all-inclusive fine printmaking publisher where Julia works with a number of artists. Andrew works there as well, and she shows her own work there and does her own work there as well, which I think is also a really great model for a publisher. So we've had the chance here to see Julia's work hung on the walls. If you haven't had a chance to, when you are able to get back up, we've got the full series of Andrew's autobiography of The Garden that we'll be seeing a little bit more about in this film. Really extraordinary to see all of this work here together. And before we begin that conversation, we'll share a short video with you all about Andrew's latest project. Some of you may have already become familiar with Andrew's Networks Rhode Island video that was produced in 2011, really an extraordinary introduction to his work. Tonight it's very exciting to show you the newer 2018 video about his latest work, also executed by Richard Gulis. It's been linked to his sort of Networks films. When you go on the site, you can find them both together. And it's really kind of extraordinary in the sense, not just that it tells us about this project, but that it shows an extraordinary sense of collaboration of different artists and craftspeople over a single project. Julia makes a cameo in here as well, working on this plate series. And we really see some extraordinary talents kind of mutually supporting one another in a way that I think showcases the best of artistic collaboration. So without further ado, let's switch to Autobiography of a Garden, the film, and then we'll come back and have a conversation with these two fine artists. Thank you. So the way this is going to work is I'd like for us to speak for, we'll speak for maybe half an hour or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from you all. I know some of you may have questions for these artists based on what you've seen and maybe on what you hear tonight. And I wanted to start by addressing this issue of passing the torch and collaboration between the two of you. You've known each other since 2013, you share a studio, you clearly have a meaningful artistic relationship and friendship. As I said before, those of us who know either of your work, I think, are not surprised to see a kinship here between these works. So I wonder, Andrew, if you could start off by telling us a little bit more about your collaboration with Julia, and maybe just, how rare has this been in your teaching career, and how might it have affected your own work?
Well, one thing I would say that really comes out of being a teacher at a place like RISD is I can watch the students' work, and I can really tell which ones are going to be amazing. So just thinking about the ones who really have that sense of detail, the insistence on quality, and that kind of thing, and that's really what I recognized in Julia's portfolio, but all through the time that she worked at RISD. And the summer before she started working for me, I did have some assistants, but I always had my eye on her because I knew that she would be really great to work with. And you saw Jack in the video, and Jack was the same way. He came off a plane from Shanghai and started unloading kilns. And he never stopped doing all sorts of work and assistance like that. And right as he graduated the same year as Julia. And so he set up a shop with the kiln and everything, but I knew somebody was going to hire him, and he got a job in Bennington. And I had already brought Julia in, and I really needed somebody to do the printmaking part. Because one of the things I think we've learned in ceramics is it's a very different ethos of perfection. And the ceramics people look at something and say, oh, that little bubble is okay. Whereas Julia would look at it and say, no, that little bubble is not okay. So Julia really came in at just the perfect time to set it up, but also brought just so many skills to it and such a vision to it that I think that last step couldn't have happened. And that really was, you, that and your talents and your vision for it that really brought it to its final phase, because there were hundreds and hundreds of prints that had to be made. And there was quite a bit that just didn't work out to be perfect and had to be discarded. And Julia had the quality control. I've never seen anything like it.
The scale of this project was kind of amazing. I think the film gives you a little bit of a sense of that. So, Julia, as a student and now as a professional and a printmaking colleague of Andrew's, what has this collaboration meant to you? How has it, kind of shaped both your training and who you are as an artist now? I know that's a big question.
That is a very big question. Well, I know that in terms of my inspiration and the way that I look at the medium itself, the subject matter has really infiltrated, I would say, sort of the way that I look at not only just Providence, but the rest of the world, where on the wall over here are prints that I made before I started working with Andrew. And so through the process of helping produce Autobiography of a Garden, I forget how many hours I logged, but basically painstakingly staring at Andrew's engravings day after day, hour after hour. This print up on the right-hand side here is probably the first one that I made that I really started to incorporate your line work, what I consider to be your line work, into the work itself. And so there's always been this level of like, it was because you're in the printmaking studio and you're there by yourself, and so there's only one person to talk to, and I would just sort of look at your line so often and think to myself, well, I can do that in relief printmaking. I can begin to render something without making it a silhouetted black and white graphic image. And then so the further irony there is that in engraving, it's the inverse relationship to the medium as in relief printmaking. So when Andrew's making a mark with his burin, that's the black line that's going to print, whereas when I'm making a mark with my chisel, that's the white line that's going to print. So it's a lot of time sitting there just contemplating that, thinking to myself, how crazy are you? And then professionally, more importantly, I would say, professionally, Andrew has lit the road in front of me, given me so much mentorship in terms of who to talk to, what artists to work with, what events to attend, sort of networking, but not only that, but also sales, and sort of pointing me to collections that are important to take note of or be incorporated into, and just the level that I could never have imagined. And I know that your help is just going to continue, and I tell people that you're my fairy godmother. Like,
Well, and that gives us a little bit of a segue to where you are now professionally. Can you tell us a little bit more about Overpass Projects?
Sure. So I produce fine art print publications with about 12 or 15 different artists, where I invite an artist into my studio on Pawtucket, and I act as the master printer, and the artist brings their creative impulse or inspiration, and we produce work together. And I present my own work as an Overpass Projects artist, and I pack up the portfolio and take it on the road and do portfolio visits and trade shows and try to make money for me and the artist that we both work together. So, and it's also, I do have a real focus on trying to place the work in museum and library institutional collections in a way that the artists that I work with, their networks are really more personal, and people are doing sort of end user purchases so they really rely on me. Most of them are my friends and my peers, and so they kind of rely on me to get them out into the world in sort of an institutional
And a wonderful sort of survey of some of those artists you brought in. So if you didn't get a chance to take a look at some of the works from the portfolio, please do once we're wrapped up here. You know, I wouldn't be a good art historian if I didn't delve into the work itself a little bit with you guys. And I think it's so interesting always to me seeing the ways in which two artists who know one another so well sort of play off of one another. And there's certainly very clear connections between your work, the craftsmanship, the use of black and white, the urban and kind of semi-urban settings, serial imagery, and also in both of your work we encounter kind of an eye that sees everything. There's kind of an omniscient eye to, you know, these landscapes and to the works that you do as well, Andrew. It's almost as if you're showing us things that the human eye doesn't normally notice or can't, you know, focus in on when we're sort of, you know, looking sort of dead center. And it's why I find both of your works so kind of mesmerizing. The eye kind of gets lost in these works in a really kind of joyful way. You kind of zone out and zone back in really extraordinary ways. But there are also some fascinating ways in which your work is quite distinct. You know, I think of Andrew's work as more kind of private scenes, interior scenes, whereas these are very much exterior kinds of looks at the city. Your working methods, obviously, given, you know, the way that you all are working, a little bit different, and also the presence of figures or the absence of figures in your case. So I have a couple of questions that I think hopefully will tease out some other differences or maybe some convergences too with your work. And I'm glad that you brought up line, because that's where I want to start. And you know, as with all great printmaking, that is where it starts, with the line. And you both have such distinctive kind of signatures, I think. You may think that you are sort of riffing off of Andrew's line, but I see them as so individual. Andrew, your line is so kind of exquisitely controlled, whether we're watching you do preparatory drawings with a goose quill or working with the wherein. And Julia, you're also quite astoundingly controlled, but the transmission lines that you see here, I think of that as the sort of, the quality of the sort of dynamic, sort of energized line that I see in yours. There's where everything seems almost like slightly as if you're seeing it kind of through a heat wave, right? Which is really extraordinary and a very different kind of line. In your earlier Networks film, Andrew, you said that lines are a kind of abstraction in themselves. And I'm wondering if the two of you could talk about what role line plays in your work as a vehicle for abstraction, or do you even think about line in that way? Either one of you can jump in on this.
Well, one thing I just would like to say first is that I think one of the biggest differences between Julia's work and my work is that Julia shows those power lines. In fact, they are one of her main themes, and you know, one of the themes that's been going through her work for a long time is this whole idea about the energy grid and the relationship of our energy use to the environment. And so those, to me, the lines are, the power lines are almost the most important motifs in her work. And then if you notice that I will never put an electrical wire.
This from the man who never eats off of anything made after.
So, so that I think does show a difference between us. Like there's a different kind of editing, a different kind of selection as we create our subjects. And I do also think that one thing I've always appreciated about Julia's work is that the work that she did before RISD is still relevant to the work that she's making now. And she carried it with her through that time. And that's where we really see that, looking at this work, for instance, how different the use of line is with that kind of blurring as opposed to this newer work. And I would say that the thing that's really important to me is that I have to find the appropriate way to use line for each project. So when the work that was shown in that earlier Networks video was a group of narrative prints on paper in which there were no outlines, there was no cross-hatching, and there were no dots. It was just trying to do everything with scrolling parallel lines. And I knew that when I went to this smaller format and having to work in a much more descriptive way, I'd have to come up with an entirely new way of using line. And I'm sure as I do my next project, that's going to be one of the very, very first decisions I make, is what kind of line work is going to make up the images. You know, I do see how it's not just that you're developing, it's actually that you're making choices in relation to the subjects as they change.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say was that a main difference that I definitely see between we had a conversation about this too, the main difference that I see between our landscapes is that I view them as, I view my landscapes as highly documentary. And you have a tendency to edit out and sort of highlight to focus on the things that in your narrative that you're really talking about. For me, narrative is not so much, it's always present in terms of creating printmaking. I'm always thinking about it in terms of a series, and then thereby it almost implies the narrative, one print to the next print. But it's always something that sort of relates afterwards. And I guess when I'm thinking about line in terms of working in my studio, it's a removed relationship where my source material is the world outside. I take photographs of the world outside. I'm trying to make a print that I know in my mind I could never recreate the world outside, but I'm trying to make a print that recreates that photograph that I took. And so when I'm drawing the image onto the block, I'm drawing the photograph, I'm not drawing the scene. I'm not drawing the things or the line, I'm drawing the photograph. I'm drawing the black and the white. And when I'm carving, so the further relationship is that I'm carving the negative space.
Right.
So I know that the resultant line from the print is going to be is the line that I leave behind. Not the line that I actually put my energy into, but the line that I leave behind. So then that's even further kind of removed or telescoped out from what are you drawing, what are you making? I'm making a print that happens to be representing a photograph, that happens to be representing a landscape, that is 100% focused on the energy grid. And I love the comment that you made about how it seems like you're looking through a heat wave, because my main topic, my linking theme of my entire portfolio is global warming and climate change. And these scenes are really about how we can see that that's directly connected to us and to where we live. Maybe we can imagine ourselves in one of these homes, in a car like that. So that's kind of like big.
Yeah, and I'm glad that Andrew, you brought up the change, the sort of transition, but still the shared qualities between the DSCF series, the more abstracted series here, and the seemingly more naturalistic, kind of descriptive scenes that you see here. But for you, you don't see a big difference between the way that you were thinking about line, say in this series, versus these more recent ones.
Exactly. That's the, I say, funny part about it is that these are also as a literal representation of the photograph that I took as these are.
Right.
So they merely appear to be an abstract landscape, but the way I see them is quite very literally the moment that was lived, the landscape that you drove by. If you look at the digital photo that I used as reference, that's what they look like. You know, this concept of abstract photography is in itself a paradox or an oxymoron.
Right, and that process from going from photography to drawing to actually kind of carving creates its own kind of shifts in perspective. As it does, Andrew, obviously, with your work, it always amazes me when you see you working with that beautiful, delicate, goose quill, and then there's the pure, and it's like, and yet it's just as delicate, despite the shift in what you're looking at in terms of the line. But you all have both addressed the issue of kind of seriality. Let's see if we can maybe pull some more out of that. I mean, obviously, Andrew, with your work, both with earlier series and certainly with this plate series, that notion of narrative or a serial is really important to your work. It's more subtle, but you've just brought up the same point about how seriality sometimes feels almost more maybe after the, I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but it feels more after the fact for you. I'm curious how you both feel about, why seriality works for you. Is it about showing transitions of light and time, that kind of thing, or is it about looking at, say, objects from different perspectives over a series? What does this serial kind of format mean for you?
I really came to it because of a strong desire to use my work to tell stories. So it came to me from narrative itself, and a realization that to depend on one image to say everything was too much. And some people can do it, but I always like the idea that as soon as you put two images together, you're actually suggesting something that happens in between those two images. And there's the potential for even more episodes or things that could happen within that. So for me, it comes very much from the subject matter that I want to work with. And the subject matter always comes first for me. It's not the formal idea or the medium. It's actually the theme that then leads me to select the medium that's going to support that, and then to select how many images it would take, or what would be the structure within which time is shown, which is a very important thing to think about too. And I always think about how the increments of time are shown within a still handmade image in a way that's appropriate for this particular medium as opposed to what might be done in a film or play or a novel or even a photographic narrative, right?
Actually, for you, I certainly, you very much get a sense of a particular kind of time of day and season and place within these. So your work feels sort of serial in that sense. But do you agree with Andrew that it's sort of, that narrative is, do you feel that narrative drives your work at all, or is that more, sort of a consequence rather than something that's driving?
I could argue either. I think that narrative turns into an after the fact for me.
Sure.
When I was introduced to printmaking, a professor sort of drove it home that we produce suites of prints, the same technique, the same format in a set of 6 or a set of 8 or whatever. And so that idea and kernel always stuck with me. It's also logistically easier if you're going to create several images if they all follow the same framework. So I'll sort of find a format and stick with it for a while. So I try to keep within a similar format. I'll try to keep a similar content line. And then what it ends up being is it's really, just as Andrew said, there's too many things to say in one image. So if I'm trying to make the point, it's much easier to really drive it home if it's a set of 6 images or rather than just one. So I think to these smaller images, before I did the two larger ones, I worked on these neighborhood scenes of Providence, and the concept of how crazy all the infrastructure is. And so it's like, if it's one corner, then it's sort of just a lark, but if you do 17 of them, then it's like, oh, like, this is really what the world is like.
Right, right. And you see that, and from obviously very different perspectives, but there's a shared neighborhood sensibility here, and especially, anyone who knows, the West Side and Smith Hill and these areas knows these. Even if you don't know that specific corner, you do know where you're looking.
And it's real.
It's true. So kind of connected maybe to this serial quality, I wanted to talk a little bit about autobiography and your work. Andrew, your latest series is Autobiography of a Garden, and I love the riff on Gertrude Stein, the autobiography of Alsby Toklas, so that the person who's actually creating the work is creating an autobiography for another subject. But you're no stranger to kind of cameo appearances in your own work, or central appearances, as in this series. If I think back to suit shopping, there you are in the store with Ned. And when you look at Open House, suit shopping appears in the house and does a cameo. Julia, in your work, it's a little, I find it more subtle, but also still very powerful. I feel like we're wearing kind of like Julia virtual reality goggles here. When we're looking at these views, there's very much a sense of looking through your eyes in these spaces. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of, if any of you all have seen the film Being John Malkovich, it's sort of like suddenly being Julia and kind of looking out at these spaces and seeing what you see. So to me, that feels autobiographical to a certain degree. How does your own kind of personal identity and history sort of shape your work? Is that something that kind of creeps in ways that you hadn't planned, or is that really central to your work?
Well, I'm very interested in the idea of social satire, and the kind of social satire that you might find in a Jane Austen novel or Christopher Isherwood. But I also want to make it very clear that I'm so embedded in the world that I'm satirizing that I'm just as much subject to the satire as anybody else within it. And so that's why in my older work I did just have that clue, that I was a narrator, or maybe a first-person narrator, maybe really somebody who lived in that world. And when I was thinking about doing something about, if Open House was about understanding identity through looking at people's stuff in the interior, I thought, well, if I could move outside and see how somebody makes a garden, what can we learn about that person by looking at that garden? And at first I was going to go to the outside world to look for that garden, but then I realized it was actually time to turn back towards myself and sort of see where that took me. So I do think about it quite a bit, even though I often worry about the condition of contemporary art, contemporary fiction, where we always interpret it as autobiography. I do think there's other ways to see it, and that's why I called it Autobiography of a Garden, because I did love Gertrude Stein's idea of using the proxy narrator to tell her story in many ways through the eyes of the character of Alsby Toklas that she created. And so I thought that kind of complexity really did reflect some of the things I'm thinking about, even though it does show me 12 times.
And it has the added complexity of, as viewers, we feel there's a little bit of a sense of voyeurism almost with all of your work, where you're not quite sure if you're allowed to be in this scene, sort of watching someone in a private moment tending a garden or trying on clothes in a men's room and suit shopping, those kinds of things, which I think adds an extraordinary sense of intimacy to these. Julia, do you think it's fair that I see Julia virtual reality goggles when I look at these, or do you feel like this shows a unique perspective that is kind of entirely your own when you look at these cityscapes?
I think it is fair, but I think, so it's interesting that it's interesting to me that you see my personality in the view. What's important to me is usually this idea that, yes, the imagery is all from my perspective, from my camera, out of my eyes, but what I want the viewer to see is that it's their eyes too. It's not an obtuse perspective,
Mm-hmm.
It's not an overarching, omniscient perspective, but it's this idea that we are all experiencing the same world around us. Like I typically shy away from work that is really talks about work that's already inside the museum, or work that's really talking to other artwork that's already been made.
Mm-hmm.
Or I think a lot about my audience, and I want the audience to be not exclusive of anybody, completely inclusive of anybody walking down the street in Federal Hill, anybody walking down the street in any residential zone that's going to notice something in the neighborhood. I think that to have an approachable inlet for the work, something that anybody can see the work and respond to it, because it talks about the world around us. It doesn't necessarily talk to something that you need to study a lot. And so, it's kind of like when you're trying to look at yourself outside of yourself, I wouldn't necessarily see that I see myself in them, but I also, it makes total sense to me that you say that. Something that, one of your questions that I would just say I don't even really know the answer of is that your background has gotten you here, or what from your history has inspired sort of this trajectory. And honestly, I ask myself that all the time, and I don't really know. All I know is that when I was a kid, it was like I wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to be a chemist inside a nuclear power plant. And when I learned about printmaking, it was finally this nexus between science and art that I couldn't run away from, and that was. So in terms of like the content, I've always just been very aware, interested in engineering, science, power generation, global warming, climate change, etc. And that must be why.
Well, in that perspective, and the more even kind of overt inclusion of yourself in your work, to me, I mean, that becomes an act of generosity for the viewer. I mean, and that's got a long art historical tradition of the artist acting as a kind of mediator, or someone who can lead you into the work in a way that is inviting, that does sort of allow you to feel kind of welcome in that space. And I see that in both of your works, in very, very different ways. It's interesting, so bringing up the notion of trajectory. I mean, nobody really knows what a trajectory looks like until it's finished anyway. So, like, nobody knows where you are on a particular arc, but I'm gonna ask you guys anyway. At this point in your, kind of professional life, where do you see the next step? I mean, Andrew, you've done such exciting and maybe unexpected, maybe not unexpected for you, turns into, say, a new medium. Is there another surprise in store for your next project?
Well, I think the thing that was a surprise to me was just the whole idea of design and coming up with those forms. It's something I had never done. And most recently, that's led me to doing patterned wallpaper and letterpress.
And you did the wallpaper behind the installation for your for that opening.
Right, and I've done more wallpaper since then.
Yeah.
And what I want to do now is I've been drawing on Blackstone Boulevard. And so I want to do a scenic wallpaper, which would be an extended narrative, showing things that I've observed between people at Blackstone Boulevard. And the idea is that if this series sort of questioned what you can understand about a person by looking at a personal garden, that would be questioning what we can understand about our larger culture by looking at this space and how it's, this public space, and how it's used and taken care of by so many people. And as we all know, in Providence, it's just so unbelievable that people come from all over Rhode Island to use that place. And I know there's a subject there. I just don't it's just going to take a while to find it out. So this took me 8 years. That may take me 10, but I have to say I was talking to Julia about it the other day, and she never says, "Oh, that's crazy." That's kind of a good idea.
That's crazy.
Oh yeah, you know, we can do them 8 feet tall. You know, 30 different strips. Go around the room. Sure.
Right. Well, that's like writing. I mean, a lot of times it really does take a long time to figure out what your subject is. That's really exciting. And what about for you, Julia?
Well.
You're a very busy person. Right
Yes,
now.
well, what's fantastic about the project that Andrew's going to work on is that there's going to be a tremendous amount of R&D, and we're going to have some new studio furniture, and we're going to have to figure out how to make it, and that's one of my favorite things to do. With Overpass, I'm constantly inviting new artists to work with, and so it's always, I kind of lend over some of the reins to the artist to say, this is what I want to try to accomplish, so I'm there to help navigate that, help figure that out, and so it's really up in the air.
Right, and hopefully more collaboration between you guys.
Definitely is.
That's very exciting. So, all right, well, I'm going to end our sort of formal part of the conversation there to see if you all have questions for Julia or Andrew or about the work. So, don't be shy. The first one is always hardest. Yep.
Andrew, I have a question in regards to, you seem to be very meticulous in your process. The passion and the collect of your collection and the integrity of the work itself, as far as imagery. When it came to, after finally coming up with the shape, the feel that you were happy with, the application process of adhering your graphic or your print to that, what did you explore as far as ways to do that, and what, and how did you finally get to the point where you are now with that process of, the ceramic decal?
Well, of course, I haven't watched that film for a long time because it's so sad that Larry passed away on May 23rd. And it was really so much his expertise and being able to talk to him and to talk to other artists. But the fascinating part about developing this project is that certainly refers to the 19th century pieces that are in the collection, but that industry in England has fallen apart, and like many industrial things that go away, they get very quickly lost because everybody has a small part of it. So we really did have to look at old patents, and we then had to try to find some new materials and new ways of doing it. So the ink is definitely from 1836, but the material we printed on is something that's used for digital decals.
Yes.
And we tried so many things, did so many tests, and when that finally came out of the kiln and looked okay, we were really happy. But then Julia will tell you it wasn't foolproof, because she spent a lot of time applying them and printing them, and it was hard.
Did the avenue of maybe dye sublimation, heat applying the graphic on, it's almost similar to what you did, but it may be a different, in the future, it may be something to try and to experiment with, or you're still keeping the plate, using the dye sublimation ink, and still rolling the transfer on, but then heat applying, so you don't have the extra weight and the look of that ceramic, that decal, that new decal. It's just the ink embedded into the ceramic itself. Maybe another avenue to explore. It may be a cleaner, more traditional look.
I think there are definitely going to be some work, there'll be work in that regard. Because I've developed some new ceramic forms and have some ideas to go ahead with.
Looking forward to seeing that. That'd be real nice. And Julia, you mentioned in regards to when after you have a photograph, and you're just reproducing the photograph, the lines in the photograph. But it seems like you took great care and time of the subject matter and setting up your camera for that shot. Does that come back when now you're one-on-one with the substrate and removing, the material and leaving those lines? Does that first initial relationship with that image come back while you're doing that process?
Yes, it's hard to avoid, but I would say that one real link between all the work is that the use of my camera is very haphazard. Most of them are actually from the driver's seat of the car, and so there's not a lot of aiming, there's not a lot of preparing the image in any way, especially in these you can see that, so that I'll often talk about them as sort of being shot from the hip in a way. And there's a lot of editing that happens when I'm reviewing my photo album. And sort of once you jump over that hump, it's kind of, it's as rote as I can make it. Just if it's black, make it black. If it's gray, make it gray.
Thank you.
Mark?
It was such a delight to see Larry in the film here. This film captured exactly the energy of Larry Bush that I so enjoy about him. And he even spoke in this about life in the film, so it was fascinating to see that. So it was wonderful to see that. My question is, we have a wall of 6 Powerline studies behind us by Julia. And Andrew, you talked about how in your vision of the world the power lines disappear. And in Julia's, my sense is what stops her car for her to take the photograph is this great dynamic grid of power lines. So these are 2 wildly different versions of the world. And Julia, I'd love to start with you to hear why power lines are so prominent in this. And Andrew, your reflections on that.
The Powerlines have always been a really direct symbol about our contribution to global warming, our addiction to it, we're chained to it. You know, you think about what the lines do, where the lines lead to. They lead to each of our homes, but then on the other side, they lead to the coal-fired power plant. And then there was a second part of the question that I forgot.
Well, I'm curious because Andrew, he lies the power lines in his garden. You don't see them, but I'm sure they were between the synagogue and his house. I'm sure there were power lines there.
I think the only way to survive as an aesthetically aware person in the United States of America is to actually live your life as if there are no power lines. I don't see them. You know, they're there, I guess. But I edit them out every moment.
Yeah,
but then when I go to those towns in England where they have them all there, or I'm on Benefit Street, they're all there. I think that's nice. You know, you could do that.
I was speaking with someone who walks through this intersection right behind you, Andrew, which is 3 blocks from here, and he said, "Oh, I walk there every day, and I've never noticed the power lines because we do somehow take them out of our lives." And it's I don't know, it's a personal aesthetic. It's a really interesting thing. And Julia, they're so omnipresent in your prints. They could be. It's such a different. I mean, we look at the plates over there, and we look at the power lines, and it's fascinating.
Well, I remember when Julia finished Eagle Square,
Right.
and then I was walking around on Prospect and Bowen, right where the president's house is, and there are more power lines there than here. And I thought, I'd never noticed that until I saw Julia's work, because I'd always edited it out. And that's one thing that does happen with Julia's work, is it brings out, it's a reminder of what's in our digital.
Yeah, I mean, the main progression for me has been that I've actually been focusing on things that aren't the power lines. The power lines have always been the entry point for me and have been the #1 point subject matter focus. And then in any of these, the idea that I would spend so much time with sort of the perspective of the ground and the sidewalk and the siding on the houses, that is really what's new in my work since coming to Providence.
So in defense of power lines, they're trying to convince us to move to electrical power as opposed to, say, the car in your car, the engine in your car, because electricity can be provided by renewable sources. solar and wind and things like that. But we do edit them out of our lives. And this whole infrastructure that supports us becomes invisible because of that.
Well, and as I said, to me, just purely visually, these lines create such. It's almost as if every line in these is the power line. So that it's reminded when I was in architecture schools in undergrad, they never wanted us to use straight edges. They wanted to see that quality of the kind of the line as it kind of came down the page and had a kind of human energy to it. And that's what I see in sort of, that's what power lines look like. They are not, straight edge. Nor is anything in these. It's sort of, it's a signature that you can just kind of read across.
Trip, they also reinforce the Renaissance perspective lines, which
Yep.
are the underlying grids of all these perspectival scenes, and they're elided again, just as we don't see them. But here they almost come in as those sketch lines again.
Yep.
So much better.
Questions? Yes.
Andrew, we live around the corner from that garden, and I have to say, it's pure joy. And it doesn't matter when you walk by there; they're unbelievable. I don't want to say that the work is totally amazing, and then there's another kind of amazing to see it in person. The lines, the strings that he has all lined up to keep it all. I mean, it's really amazing. It's such an addition to the neighborhood, and I don't know if the characters who are experiencing the garden or the boulevard are part, if that's something that becomes a narrative.
It's something I think about, but it's something that's happened very organically over the time of working on that garden, because I've really become so much part of Providence, being here since 1991. And to me, in some ways, that garden is separate from my work. Like, I think many people know me as the guy with the hat who works on that garden on the corner and change their route home from work to see it. And I love that. And I think that's what's made me sort of intuit something about what Blackstone Boulevard is really all about too. It's about our community and what it means. There's something special there that I'm interested in finding out more about.
I wanted to just ask Julia too. Julia, I'm still here, sorry. I also see the lens in these wide ones, and the way that the lens does that distortion, they feel shot from the hip. And I just wondered if you could talk about that decision about whether or not to correct, the conversions that the lens is putting into this view, and what made you think to keep it in.
Yeah, I think there's also remnant of the windshield, definitely the dashboard of the car, and I would say that I try to alter the photograph as little as possible, even in the transition between the printout of the photograph I'm going to use as my source material. Oftentimes, if you're trying to go for a black and white print, you'll turn it into a black and white image, and I don't do any of that. The only editing of the photograph I do is sizing it.
That's the school though.
All right, well, join me in thanking these two wonderful